wrote a lot of big hits.
Sounded like Sam Cooke or
Similar to that.
yeah, same period.
Let them talk if they
Sure.
talk, don't bother.
And welcome to Let 'em Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo, and my distinguished guest, attorney Stanley Cohen, activist attorney Stanley Cohen. I love to have activist attorneys on my show because you guys are on the front lines and always have inside dope about what's going on.
Well, thank you, Paul, for inviting me.
Uh-huh.
I'd like to start out by saying, yes, I did steroids and I lied to Congress. Oh, that's Roger Clemens. I'm sorry about that. Maybe it was John Edwards. I paid my mistress with campaign funds, but no.
Oh, hypocrisy in America? Come
Oh,
on.
yes. Eric Holder, as I call it, Step and Fetch It for Yes We Can, who's turned the Department of Justice into one of the largest political enforcement mechanisms in recent history.
Well, as they've been going after leakers and keep calling whistleblowers spies and
They go
attacking
after anyone who dares to challenge what they believe is their ability to control what we think, what we do, what we hear. And of course, it's always in our best interests.
Sure, that we not see a picture of American forces machine gunning innocent people and
Correct,
things like
correct,
that,
correct.
as we've shown on this air a few weeks ago.
Well, you know, when segments of America voted for Yes We Can because they bought the Kool-Aid, they drank the Kool-Aid, and they've been waiting for 4 years for Kool-Aid to become champagne. It's that standard sort of talismanic chant. One more time, we just need another shot.
Nixon's the one, I remember.
Yeah.
Right? And I remember all those. It's always the same every 4 years.
Oh,
right?
of course it is. You
Right,
got to
and
wait
it's
for
one
the
of those
next
years.
four, the next
Right.
four, the next four.
So, Stanley Cohen, let's set the record straight, all right? Because I want to talk a lot about your experience, and I've shared many experiences with you on the front lines, from Canada, from the Mohawk Nation to the Lower East Side and the Squatter Nation. And but I've not been following all your work in upstate New York, and it seemed like out of the blue, to me it seemed out of the blue, you were come under charges. I don't know, indicted? Is that the word?
Yeah, actually I was charged. It's interesting because no one can really figure out what it's called impeding the U.S. tax code. And what I found interesting is for the first time in 30 years of being, you know, on the front lines, as you say, of fighting the good fight, all over the country, indeed all over the world, I find the right wing flocking to my support. You know, and, oh, a tax resistor, and a tax fighter. And now, listen, it's this charge has absolutely nothing to do with my work upstate, and the charge has nothing to do with my work domestically, I don't think. I think, you know, we're fairly comfortable, and we think we're going to discover, and we'll prove during discovery, that it has its genesis in my political work in the Middle East.
Yeah.
As long ago as 10 years ago, I was told by a client of mine whose house was raided and a picture was taken from his house by a federal prosecutor. Well, it ended up on the wall of a federal prosecutor in Alexandria, Virginia. A picture of Ahmed Yassin and Ismail Abu Shanab, the founder of Hamas and one of the leaders, and myself, taken in Gaza. And taped on the wall behind the prosecutor's desk was an X through Ismail's face, an X through Ahmed Yassin's face, and a circle
They're
around
targeted.
my head.
Oh, a circle around your
My
head,
head.
right?
So look, if anyone believes that I've been, you know, charged by the United States government for impeding the tax code, you know, I have a bridge for them to buy.
Okay.
We believe that
What does impeding the tax code
well,
mean?
they have this theory that you know, look, you know me decades.
Yes.
People know me. I work 20 hours a day, 7 days a week,
Absolutely.
and have for 30 years.
You're one of those attorneys who dedicates themselves to their clients.
Well, listen, all over the world. And some of them are pot growers in Northern California, and many of them are political activists. I represent Hamas. I've represented Hezbollah. I've represented Libyan freedom fighters. I've represented resistance in Iraq. I'm in the Middle East all the time. I represent Native Americans. I've represented the IRA. The list goes on and on.
Sure.
This is what I've been doing
And
for
you've
30
come under
years.
charge. I remember, didn't you come under charges in Oka?
I was indicted in Canada and charged
right.
with seditious conspiracy.
Seditious conspiracy in another country.
Yeah, I'm not a Canadian citizen, and they charged me with seditious conspiracy, and I was facing a 20-year jail sentence there. And after
That's
2
even
years,
arguably more serious.
yes, the 3-year count that I'm facing now. And that case was dismissed, and I don't know if this case will be dismissed, but I think a jury will say not guilty. But
So that's not tax evasion.
No,
'cause
no,
that's
no,
what-
this is not
That
income
was the
tax.
original story in
Wrong.
the Schenectady newspaper.
not income tax evasion. This is a charge that says, and the theory behind this is great, that I'm so diabolical. I've never represented a tax case in my life. I wouldn't know
Sure.
the tax code if I fell over it.
Okay.
The theory is,
Which is easy to do, I'm told.
I diabolically set about through a systematic pattern of practices or non-practices over a period of time of running my one-person law firm in such a way to make it difficult for the IRA to figure IRA Freudian slip
No.
the IRS to figure out how much I've made.
Uh-huh.
They're not claiming there's any mansions or boats or accounts or Krugerrands or offshore or anything. It's just they said you've been doing this forever, and because you don't have all these things, something smells. You've done something.
Oh, I see.
And so really what's happened is the period in controversy, we're fighting over how much money or how much or how little is owed, where extensions were filed.
Mm. Usually, don't people just get a bill for things like that?
Well, unless they're Stanley Cohen.
Yeah.
This has been, and I'll tell you quite frankly, what happened was we've been having this. We've sued the Northern District of New York and the Southern District.
Okay.
We filed complaints against investigative agencies.
Those are federal courts here.
Yeah. And then about a month before the charge was returned, I instructed my lawyers to file a formal complaint with the Department of Justice in Washington saying, look, you've got to take these in a career-building case 15 years ago off the case for the following 24 reasons.
Sure.
And we submitted a very lengthy this is what they've done,
Sure.
this is where they violated the law, this is where it's bullshit, this is where it's harassment, this is where it's designed to penalize and punish me for who I am. And of course my attorney said, you realize they're not going to charge you. And I said, well, let them charge me. And almost a month
Retaliation?
almost a month to the day that we filed the complaint,
Sure.
I was charged.
Okay.
Now, I am comfortable that a jury, I don't know if they're going to be a jury of my peers, but we'll have to we'll take a look at this crap, and we'll take a look at my history, and we'll take a look at the many people, including federal judges and ex-prosecutors and political leaders and figures that have called and said, call us as a character witness, and they'll see what this is. It's a petty vendetta.
Right. This whole idea, there's a lot of things I want to ask you about Stanley Cohen. One of the things I want to ask you about is your work in the Middle East. I want to ask about your legal work too, but here in the United States, but your work overseas for basically Hezbollah,
More so Hamas.
Hamas mostly. The head of the PLO at the time, Yasser Arafat, right? And different people. You're ethnically Jewish, right? You were raised Jewish?
I was raised a human being.
Okay.
And I get asked when I was a younger quote player in the region involved in things, I used to get asked this question a lot. I no longer do because I proudly was voted in 2004 by the JDO, the number one the world's leading self-hating Jew.
Okay.
No, it's very simple. It's not about religion; it's about occupation.
Sure.
The flashpoint in the region in the Middle East for decades has been the theft of Palestine, the destruction of the Palestinian land, the enslavery of the Palestinian people, the occupation. It's done every day of the week in the name of my parents and my grandparents and my ancestors, some of whom I lost in the Holocaust, some I've lost during the decades of the resistance. If I'm not going to play a role in trying to put an end to this genocide, who will? Every day of the week, Netanyahu and his dogs, and before that Sharon and their war criminals, take steps they claim on behalf of world Jewry. And it's nonsense. It's on behalf of a small group, sick group of Zionists who have used it as a pretext to steal land, to murder Palestinians, to jail and torture political opponents. So if I'm not going to do it, who will? And it's that simple. It's not about Muslim, it's not about Jew, it's about morality, decency, power politics, and occupation.
All right. So that's, how did you first make your contact with these clients?
Well, it's interesting because, I, for many years, had been involved in resistance politics and representing resistance groups. Sure. Around 1990, I was reached out to by some folks that were involved in the liberation movement in Yugoslavia by Kosovans who were Muslims. And I began to do work around Albania and Kosovo and that region of the world. And then in 1995, I think, I got a phone call.
Go ahead.
One day I was getting ready to go on holiday, and I got a phone call from a friend of mine in Washington.
Sure.
He said, listen, there's a very influential, important Muslim who's been arrested, taken into custody.
Sure.
He's been in the United States, a green card holder, and he's on his way. We'd like you to stop in. And I said, I can't do it. I just finished a squatter trial. It was 7 weeks.
Sure.
My girlfriend will kill me. We've got a little cabin in Maine. He said, well, his name is Musa Abu Marzouk. And I said, well, look, give Mr. Marzouk my regards.
Right.
And he said, well, perhaps you'd like to know, have you ever heard of Hamas? And I said, of course. He said, well, he's the head of Hamas. I said, I think I'll forget about the cabin.
Okay, you'll take
So
this case,
I went
right?
to see Musa, and we became dear friends, and I
Mhm.
represented him for 2 years. I
Sure.
beat Israel, and he was,
What was the nature of that case?
well, Israel, initially he was arrested because he was charged with some sort of violation of INS laws in the United States. But then,
Yeah.
in the first time and only time in history of Israel, the Knesset issued an arrest warrant for him
All right.
and wanted to charge him with mass bombings and murders as the head of Hamas. So they were seeking to extradite him to stand trial for the bombings, the suicide operation,
The
the
alleged
martyrdom
these
operations.
allegations, right?
And we fought it for about 2 years, and
Okay.
midway through, Abu Marzouk said, okay, tell Israel I'm ready to come back. And Israel said,
Oh.
no, we don't want you.
Oh, when he decided to drop his defense and go.
Well, he ended up going back to Amman, and then, as a result of representing Abu Marzouk, and succeeding,
Yeah.
needless to say, it provided an entree to a world of people and persons and beliefs and politics and an understanding that had only been fairly academic for me previously, and that's 17, 18 years ago now.
Mhm.
So I've spent a good chunk of my last 18 years involved in Middle Eastern politics.
And you have an uncanny way to step over divides. I mean, Hamas does not get along with the Palestinian Authority or the PLO,
Mhm.
and yet you turn around and were later a representative of Yasser Arafat, who was head of the PLO and who is now being investigated that he was murdered.
Well,
What do
it
you think?
wasn't-
Was he
it
murdered?
Oh, absolutely, he was murdered.
Radiation? They're saying polonium or some radioactive substance.
Who knows? But I suspect it was a combination of Israeli-provided poison to probably Fatah insiders who were being blackmailed by Israel, because that's what Israel does.
Mhm. That was his military force.
Yeah,
Fatah.
well, the Fatah's a movement, but listen, I've been many things in many places. Hezbollah is a Shia movement, and when Al-Manar was designated and there was a question about whether they were going to sue,
Mhm.
when they shut down the TV network, Hezbollah
Sure.
asked me to deal with the case. I've been an advisor to Shia movements. I've been advisor to tribal movements in Yemen. I've counseled the government in Qatar and in Yemen, and I recently was in Damascus. North Africa, I've got lawsuits pending against Israel and Algeria, in the ICC in Morocco and Spain. So I get around.
Right. That's so that would arise. Suspicion arises in me that the government might have targeted you for this kind of work.
Oh, there's no doubt about it.
You're an American citizen, Jewish ethnicity. You're defending these people. You're giving them a certain amount of credibility in the world.
Well, it's not just that. I'm a voice. I spend a lot of time in the public in the Middle East. I say lots of things that are very unpopular in terms of the United States.
Mhm.
I have made many friends in the Middle East and Southeast Asia and parts of the world, and I've made many enemies in the United States. I don't bite my tongue. I've challenged the United States. I was a prosecutor in the War Crimes Tribunal and prosecuted George Bush in Cairo. I've been a lecturer in Turkey and Lebanon and Syria and in Doha. I've done the Doha debates.
Sure.
I've done stuff in the ICC. I've sued the United States government. I've sued United States corporations. I've sued
You
Israel.
have a track record with these guys.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and what's it like? Was there a growing feeling of hostility coming from the prosecutors in the different offices you were fighting these cases in?
No, look.
Did you feel like they were starting to get mad? I mean, I just remember when they took Kunstler off of the Gotti case, when they pulled, and many times they pull a lawyer who's successful in defending a client from defending that person again.
I think history will show that AIPAC has played a role in this. I think the Zionist lobby has played a role in this. I think there are particular prosecutors in the Department of Justice who've been laying wait and saying, we're going to get this guy, we don't care what it is. They'd like to tie me up, they'd like to drain me financially, they'd like to affect my ability to practice. When I appeared in court, they tried to get my passport. The judge refused to order it to be surrendered.
Okay, Mr. So-called self-hating Jew, as Peasy's enemies have called you. You have people like outside your door, right?
Yeah.
Picketing your door, saying
My
that-
life's been threatened. There was there have been, I had to have security for a period
Sounds
of
like
time.
some other people are the haters.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's interestingly enough.
It's interesting where people say to me, they say, my God, aren't you afraid in the Middle East? I say, no, I'm afraid in New York. The Middle East, I feel at home.
That's interesting.
I have no problems in the Middle East. I go where I want, when I want. I have lots of friends. I have a pretty good following. And I feel more comfortable there than in the United States.
All right, we'll come back to this, but let me let you go a little bit, go around and give me. I'm really interested in your opinions about this Arab Spring that's been happening, starting with Egypt. And today, the news is in Egypt that the Supreme Court has ruled that they have to disband, not disband.
Well,
the
actually, the
Parliament
met again today to figure
and
out.
it's
what
actually it's not really who's winning and who's on top of who is still unclear.
The Arab Spring, to begin with, Egypt was not an Arab Spring, but a military coup. Initially, the military, which has controlled, the Egyptian, infrastructure for decades, and which owns 60% of the economic infrastructure of Egypt, so they certainly have a vested interest, said enough for Mubarak. Okay. Suleiman, you're gone. Mubarak, you're gone. This is getting shaky. Yeah. So what started out as a youth movement for a, quote, revolution, my view was at least initially, was a military coup. Since then, we've now seen the next generation, the next step. We've got the arrival of the Brotherhood. You've got a marriage of the Brotherhood along with some secular liberation movements. Sure. They're now challenging the military. What's interesting about the so-called Arab Spring, and I gave a lecture in Gaza about 2 months ago, and one of the topics was the Arab Spring. We in the West like to believe that the Arab Spring was an uprising by Arab youth yearning to become more Western, wanting to be more American, wanting better jeans, wanting more clothes, wanting better music, et cetera, et cetera. When the Arab Spring, to the degree that it is a yearning, it's a return to pan-Arab nationalism. It is an Arab movement that says, no longer will we allow the West, through the United States, through Israel, through Europe, through France, to control our destinies. We want to take our destinies into our own hands. We want to be Arabs, we want to be Muslims, we want to be Coptics, we want to be Jews. We want to control our own destiny. And not increasingly, one of the first words you hear from all of the revolutionary movements in the Middle East right now is Palestine. We'd like to think this is people want to become Yes We Can. That, Yes We Can went to Egypt, he gave his great speech, he got his, Nobel Peace Prize, he looks good coming out of the water, Americans love him, he's a regular guy, and now everyone wants to become more American. Nothing could be further from the truth. This has its roots in Nasserism. It has its roots. It really is...
Nasser was the nationalist leader in the 1950s.
It really is what I consider to be the beginning of the end of neo-colonialism in the Middle East and in the Gulf. And where you find the greatest resistance is among those states, particularly in the Gulf, where neo-colonialism is live and strong and still fighting.
Possibility of war between the United States and Iran, Israel and Iran, is that a possibility in your mind?
Zero.
How about Syria? What's happening there?
Syria is a very complicated matter. There's no doubt in my mind that, unlike in Libya, where the Libyan revolutionary movement invited NATO in, and NATO now controls most of the oil and most of the oil fields, and you've got tribal separatism and war going on, internal war now. I think what you're seeing in Syria is the insinuation quietly and covertly of NATO and the United States and Israel into internal politics.
You were recently in Damascus, right?
I was there at the end of November. Yeah.
And what was it like then in November?
There was the scent of death in most places. Damascus at that point had not yet seen any real violence or fighting.
Yeah.
I was there for a couple of days. I spoke to some people. I appeared on television, and then I left. Syria is a very difficult situation. Syria has been one of the strongest supporters of Palestinian resistance and freedom of any nation in the region. Syria has stood head to toe against the United States in a lot of ways and against Israel in a lot of ways. But Syria also has a track record of suppressing the legitimate aspirations of an enormous Sunni population that feels disenfranchised. It's difficult. You've got NATO trying to carve it up right now. Yeah. You have this incredible competition right now between Turkey, Iran. The United States single-handedly brought back the Persian Empire to Iraq.
Okay.
So there's lots of forces. You have the last vestiges of what we carved up in the Gulf states. The Saudis are involved. Qatar is playing an active role, and the Emir is a friend of mine.
Is there any hope there? I mean, so many people, when you talk about Palestinians and Israelis, when you talk about these countries and their relations, they seem to have lost hope that there's no way out of it.
I am more optimistic right now than I have been in 15 years.
What gives you that optimism?
That I think the stranglehold of the United States and Israel in the region is dying. It's in its final stages. I think the Arab Spring is developing a new spring of resistance, a new level of resistance against the manipulation by Israel and the United States. I think the issue of Palestine is on the front burner. I think The days of the Spartan Empire that I call Israel are coming to an end as we know it now. I think America's failed adventurism in the Middle East has once and for all shown that all we bring is death and destruction, and then we try to plunder natural resources. I think that...
You didn't celebrate when they got Osama?
Oh, listen, if
you were here with us. So you were here. We were there together, right in the middle of it.
Let me tell you, if Osama didn't exist, George Bush would have had to create him. Right. The issue was never about Osama bin Laden. In fact, tragically on many levels, the Palestinian movement was set back by even more than the United States as a result of 9/11.
Sure.
Because Sharon put his little flag on, Sharon started waving his flag, Sharon started comparing Palestinian resistance and nationalism to Al-Qaeda, and Americans swallowed the Kool-Aid and bought it. So it set back the independence movement for a decade, but I think it's back on track now. I'm optimistic. I think that Hamas has again proven itself to be the legitimate representatives of Palestinian aspirations. That, quote, an Arab Spring in Ramallah, where more and more people are challenging the PA. I think the investigation of the assassination...
Palestinian Authority, the government.
Yeah,
there.
The assassination of Arafat is going to expose things. I think Abu Mazen or Abbas is in his final stages along with Al-Fayyad. I think...
Who are these people you just mentioned?
Well, Abu Mazen is the president of the PA. We know him here as Abbas.
Right.
Fayyad is the foreign minister who represents the interests of the International Monetary Fund. Okay. Dahlin, who was an assassin for Fatah and for the United States, has been thrown out. Increasingly, Palestinians on the ground understand that the key to success is the removal of Western manipulation, Western control, and that as long as the West is able to control and dictate the politics on the ground in Palestine, they're destined to continue down the same dark alley. And increasingly, Palestinians have come to grips with the fact that Fatah, that the Palestinian Authority has acted like as a rubber stamp for Israel and the United States for a solid 10 years now.
Now, are you surprised, because we covered, and I've had Ralph Pointer and Lynn Stewart on the show numerous times, and now Lynn's doing this extended sentence that they gave her for speaking out during her time, and yet now she was accused of helping the Sheikh Rahman, who's in prison, and now the elected Egyptian government
wants him back.
Not only wants him back, but the person who the Sheikh was accused of trying to involve in his assassination or whatever it was is in prison. Locked up in a prison.
Well, listen, for 27 years, Nelson Mandela was the world's leading terrorist, and everyone falls all over each other to get a photo op with him. Malcolm X, by any means necessary, is now a postage stamp. There's a fine line between terrorist and freedom fighter, and it's who wins. The region is going through some enormous change right now. The politics are going through enormous change. And if your question is, do I believe that the political horizons in the Middle East will affect the political balance in the West? Absolutely. It's the reverse of what's happened for 100 years. That now we have, for the first time in literally decades, in many decades, where Middle Eastern, where Islamic and secular Palestinians and Arabs from the entire coast in Southeast Asia are organizing, are coming to the forefront, are demanding independence and to set their own course, and I believe they will.
Next few minutes, let's come back to your case. So, how does a person who's like a statesman, you're traveling the world, you're involved in all these cases, wind up at the focus of a petty tax case that is usually settled by one of those services you pay $500 to on television? Well,
the cynics among us might believe that it's not mere happenstance and coincidence, that I've been targeted for years, that they've worked their way down to find any problem, and now it's essentially a regulatory situation, although they've tried to dress it up in criminal garb. Look, this is a desperate government. Those people that stand, that challenge, that speak out, that resist, that support those that challenge its policies, and as I have in particular, step and fetch it holder on behalf of Yes We Can Obama, are going to be singled out.
I see.
We've seen two enormous losses for the Department of Justice recently. One, Roger Clements, another one, John Edwards. They go after people.
What do you think in the last few minutes, Assange, Bradley Manning, these whistleblower cases?
Well, I'm representing Mercedes Hafer, who's the lead defendant in the so-called PayPal hacking case in Northern California right now. Look, it's the prince has no clothes. The one thing that all governments have in common, at least Western governments, is they must maintain the illusion of invincibility, and they must be able, in their own minds, to sell you a bill of goods.
Okay.
And once the information gets out that the prince has no clothes, that it's basically one huge scam, that that the military-industrial complex and intelligence community, for lack of a better word, is running the show, once that gets out, they're in trouble. And increasingly in the so-called whistleblower cases, that's what's happening, and we're now seeing government making First Amendment activities to be, deadly acts of domestic terrorism.
What they're doing to Assange it's just, mind-blowing, because, whatever happened in Scandinavia was obviously not the purpose of holding him in jail the way they've been doing, or holding him, under the control and the thumb of the British government, and filling everybody with this fear that they're going to hand him right over to the United States. I mean, it's like, they're dripping. I mean, nobody in their right mind could not believe that.
I'm less concerned about Assange than I am the worldwide attack on 20 and 21 and 22-year-old kids that are coming together and organizing, that are learning how to speak out.
Occupy Wall Street, you're saying?
Well, Anonymous, Occupy Wall Street, people that are the next generation of leadership that are standing up and sacrificing. I'm more concerned about them.
What do you think about that? Last couple of minutes, I saw you down at Occupy Wall Street, down at Zuccotti Park. What do you think the way the Bloomberg administration, the police here, and throughout the United States, around the world, have treated this movement?
In the long run, the movement has grown stronger than ever because of the way they were manhandled and abused and treated by Bloomberg. You and I both know, having been around, involved in struggles and resistance movements, the more you beat it, the more you attack it, the more you focus on it, the more you single it out, the more it grows, the more popular, the more determined it becomes.
It's like a nemesis on Star Trek.
No justice, no
right.
peace.
Yeah.
So I'm not concerned about it. It's learned to morph out into new ways and new strategies in new places. And I think
you don't think it's over?
Oh, no. No, listen. You can't steal the spirit from the young who believe and are committed to justice. You can jail them, you can beat them, you can harass them, but you can't ultimately destroy them or quiet them.
Well, I'll never forget that experience we had in Oka, Quebec, when we were behind the lines with the natives at the treatment center, surrounded by the Canadian Army, and they're firing projectiles at us, and it was one of those amazing nights I ever spent. And thank you for that. I want to shake your hands, but thank you for that experience, of letting me to come in through those lines.
I was there 4 months.
And I'll never forget. I'll never forget the power you had over that general or colonel from the Quebecois, from the Quebec Army, and the way you said, well, what he said to you, what more do you want? And he said, points to me and goes, I want him.
And you were in.
And I was in. There
and
I
then,
was.
And then
he goes, you. Like me looking like I just washed up on the shore. You could have him.
And then 3 months later, the Army arrested me, and 2 years later, the case was dismissed. And that's
2
what
years
happened
under
here.
indictment in Canada.
Yeah, 2 years.
For doing that, for defending those people. And,
well, I was asked, the Canadian government said...
We have to go. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Take care. Thank you, Stanley Cohen.